much, Comrade Scholar. Motho wa Kgamadi. Ke nne. Motsweneng wa matlapa lehadimeng, lehadima ke ho sheba thabeng. Tshwene e rita thabeng, tlapa le letsho ke sheba dithaba. Leme le letsho ke ho koma ditlhare. Motsweneng a khiba le Kgamadi, leleme le letsho ke eng? Leleme le letsho ke ho koma ditlhare. Ke nna. Oftentimes in these spaces, we introduce ourselves by our credentials, our qualifications. Not that that's important, that's okay. But often we forget who we are. Our totems carry our histories. Our totems remind us of our responsibilities. And these are part of the oppressive systems that made us forget who we are as a people. Dr. Gordon, you spoke about the power of the arts when you were here earlier. The arts as a powerful tool for unleashing the imagination, and how the apartheid regime was very intentional in ensuring that they suppress the Black people and try to kill the imagination. But try as they did, we are a people of rhythm. We are a people of imagination. Try as they did, they could never really succeed. I am unfortunately from a discipline called psychology. I share the discipline with people like Hendrik Verwoerd. He was a psychologist. He was a psychology scholar. And it was through psychology that the Bantu education system came to be. It was through this discipline that the segregation was entrenched into law, that he became the minister of the Bantu administration, right? And it was through psychology that was made into law, because it was scientific that Black people are inferior. It was psychology that did that. And we go to universities, we study psychology. It's not moving. Oh, I need help. Maybe you can just move it for me. I'll just say next slide. Ne? Thank you. So next slide. So in the year 2007, going to take us back in history a little bit as a way to try and make my point. In the year 2007, Black workers at the University of the Free State were made to drink urine by white students. Some of those workers could have easily been my mother, my aunt, my uncle, my father. The disciplinary action against student culprits was dropped by the then Vice Chancellor, Jonathan Jansen, much to the disappointment of many people who wanted to see justice served. Such occurrences may be perceived as signs of disrespect and a reminder that while on paper colonialism might be over, its remnants still reverberate in the everyday. I show this image as a reminder. She's kneeling down, right, as she's made to do this. Earlier, Melissa spoke about Dr. Mzileni, We speak about the cleaner that was made to drink urine. And today we're dealing with Dr. Mzileni, who is now undergoing disciplinary hearing. So the black body in these spaces, always in question. So whether you are a cleaner on this side, or whether you are an academic on the other side, your blackness is a perpetual problem. W.E.B. Du Bois spoke about how does it feel to be a problem. Professor Shabani Manganyi also speaks about this, the idea of blackness as a problem, of us being made strangers to ourselves. And so these make headlines for a day or two, and then we move on. But does it end? It doesn't, because in 2022, a white student walked into the university's residential room of a black student at Stellenbosch University and urinated on this student's belongings. These acts get repeated because they often happen with impunity. This happens because black bodies are deemed as bodies that do not belong. How dare you come to Stellenbosch? How dare you come to the Free State? How dare I come to the University of Pretoria? Perceived as subhuman, we are consciously treated as what Frantz Fanon refers to as the wretched of the earth. We can pause and ponder on this obsession with urine, but for now I shall leave it there. And then on the 31st of May in 2021, pupils and their parents protested on the premises of Cornwall Private School in Pretoria because of the racism experienced by black children at the school. One of the pupils addressed the school saying that her first and foremost vivid memory of racism happened when she was in grade 4. She would have been about 9 or 10 years old, right? And she says, I was happily on my way to break when a teacher stopped me. She looked me dead in the eye and said, your hair is unpresentable. It is messy and it's not the Cornwall way. She also proceeded to tell me that I'd look better if I chemically treated my hair. She said, after that encounter, I believed there was something wrong with my natural kinky hair. And for a long time, I was uncomfortable wearing my natural hair to school. This is a 9 or 10-year-old, a black child. It is such moments where we are painfully reminded that decoloniality is necessary as coloniality continues to rear its head in the classrooms, during school breaks, always reminding us of the audacity of whiteness as it pierces through people's sense of being in the world. It is important for us to look back as we imagine the future, because it is history that teaches us. When the Cornwall child was made to believe that there was something wrong with her, I too was taken back to my own childhood, where while I was around 5 years old and doing grade 1, I and others around my age had to jump school fences because the police were entering school premises looking for troublemakers. It was a primary school, children between 6 and 13 years old. The police came looking for troublemakers. Back then, like this little girl from Cornwall in 2021, we were made to believe that something was wrong with us. The markers of such trauma is in our memories and in our psyches. Here, Ndlovu Kacheni's notion of the vampirism of technologies of imperialism rings true. Ndlovukatsheni argues that we need to understand the invisible vampirism of technologies of imperialism and colonial matrices of power that continue to exist in the minds, the lives, our languages, our dreams, our imaginations, and epistemologies of modern subjects in Africa and the entire global South. So we cannot just move on as if it's business as usual, because all of these live in us. Next slide. I was in high school when 1994 came. And even though, no, the previous slide. Thank you. I was in high school when 1994 came. And even though I could not vote yet, I experienced the hype, the excitement, the hope, and the dawn of a new era, a new world. The first democratic election brought hope for all of us, as it meant we could imagine a future that would have been near impossible before 1994. Even though I went to a township school that struggled with resources needed for proper education, thanks to Verwoerd, and teachers that equally struggled, 1994 offered us a possibility to dream. I completed my high school and went on to further my studies at a previously white-only institution. This came with challenges of its own, as we were made to feel like imposters in someone's home or someone's private space. It was at the university where I truly understood what my Blackness meant, my Blackness as a threat, as an unwanted body, as a misplaced human. The racism experience was violent and immediate. The experience fueled my activism and passion for fighting for social justice. We look at this image full of hope, voting for the first time. I'm reminded of the image that one of the young people have drawn and shown us this morning of the Union building as that space, that history, right? The possibility, the greener pastures. People were dreaming because they were hoping for the greener pasture. And fast forward, here we are today. Coloniality makes that impossible, right? Colonialism ended, but the remnants of it, the power shift has not truly happened. And so I start with this to position myself as I speak about uncertainties, exhaustion, and absences. I speak from a position of exhaustion because the struggles started when I was an innocent child, born Black, in an oppressive system that saw me and those who look like me as a problem and undeserving of dignity and a decent life. I'm exhausted because years later, I'm standing here speaking about the convenient amnesia that is meant to exempt and render many white people innocent because they were not there when the apartheid police chased me, a 5-year-old, out of my school with tear gas. How do we understand absence when the material gains and access to resources continue to be skewed in this country? These are the provocations and questions that I come with today. Educational scholar Maxine Green frames provocation as an optimistic and productive action. To provoke is to encourage individuals, is to encourage us to reach beyond ourselves in our intersubjective space. It is an action that incites what is not yet in our social becomings. The world is full of savagery. It's full of brutal marginalization. It's full of structured silences. And imposed invisibility is there. It's so present all around us. Therefore, we need to question, to critique, and to invoke. I'm full of stories, so I'm going to tell you a lot of stories. I was talking to a white lady the other day, a few weeks ago, and she was sharing with me how some of her family members have now moved and they live in Germany, and the way they feel ashamed and implicated in the Holocaust. She went on to share with me how her family members also feel a sense of guilt about what the Germans did to the Jews. She then said something quite interesting. She said, "It is said that my family does not feel the same sense of shame when it comes to apartheid. Instead, they distance themselves from it and do not feel personally responsible for it," what you were saying earlier, Melissa. They are oblivious and ignorant to how their privilege is directly linked to what apartheid did to African people in South Africa. So I ask, is this ignorance, or is it deliberate and conscious disregard and refusal to acknowledge persistent white privilege and its direct link to Black people's perpetual dehumanization and suffering? Clearly, there is awareness of the need for acknowledging the shame, acknowledging the oppression, acknowledging the dehumanization, but it goes back to that idea of the Black body, you know, as subhuman or non-human. Therefore, how do you feel guilty or shame? Because it's a body that does not count, right? But we can feel sorry for the Jews because they are bodies that count. And this is something that I think Melissa over the years has been contemplating on and written about quite a lot. And I would like to echo you, Melissa, that ever since democracy was introduced here in South Africa, it has been a common joke that you will never find people who embraced apartheid. More and more white South Africans are asserting that they were not born, or rather they were born after the end of apartheid, and hence they are not responsible for the conditions under which Black people lived under apartheid. As we are aware that the platform of racial apartheid could not have been functional or sustained for over 4 decades without the active and passive cooperation of the white population, can we really plead ignorance? And this spoke to the everyday realities of people. It spoke to our transportation system. It spoke to who could access the beaches. It spoke to who could enter which theaters. It spoke to who can enter which restaurants from which entrance. It spoke to how Black people could be paid minimum wages. It spoke to how best schools were reserved only for a few. So instead of changing the past, they merely facilitated a more favorable or at least more comfortable present for whiteness in South Africa, producing what Mills, who was mentioned earlier, terms a feel-good past for whites. The tragedy is that as a result of the rewritten history and altered reality of apartheid, white South Africans hold spaces of ignorance in their convictions. But I think people cannot sit with their ignorance, and that's why it's important for us to challenge, to question, to critique. Because whiteness is also characterized by an insufferable defensiveness in the face of criticism. It wasn't me, My grandparents, I wasn't there, but you're owning a farm, right? You inherited things. So how can you not see the link and the connection between all these things? When whites and whiteness are examined in South Africa, the universal claim of whiteness to truth, knowledge, and morality is brought into sharp and unsettled focus. Which truth counts? Which history counts? Whose knowledge counts? When people live under oppressive and dehumanizing circumstances, they find ways to survive and to cope. Black people have been politicized over time and respond in varying ways to challenges that they persistently confront in their daily lives. In a way, people have what we can call political selves, and these selves are in relation to the colonial system that has wounded us and that has killed us. Scholars such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Frantz Fanon, South American scholar Paulo Freire have documented that our encounters of living through the colonial system start with the colonialists themselves. The point of departure for the oppressed is striving for humanity or humanization. However, our humanity is denied by injustice, perpetual injustice, exploitation, oppression, and violence at the hand of the oppressor. Freire maintains that the oppressed always yearn for freedom and to recover their humanity. The search for humanity translates to the behavior or psyche of Black people in relation to surviving and being in the world that is opposed to their humanity. Seeking humanity could mean assimilating into the system of oppression, navigating acceptance in the world of the oppressed and the oppressor, and resisting the oppressive system. All these alternatives are quite taxing on one's mental and psychological well-being. Thus, seeking freedom and liberation involves psychological warfare and mind games from the oppressive system. Physical or visible oppression has always been regarded as important. However, I'd like to argue that psychological oppression is equally, if not more, important if one is to understand the depth of the suffering of marginalized people as a result of colonization. Charles Mills and Nancy Tuana write on epistemologies of ignorance or epistemologies of privilege, which keep us from knowing the deep and complex truths of social oppression, racial oppression, carceral oppression, which bodies, which people are incarcerated over and over and over again. Just look at the US. It's a market, right? It's about profit. So the more Black people are incarcerated, the more money someone is making out there. It's about gender issues, gender inequities. It's also about being able or disabled and the needs of people in this sense. So understanding of social events and connections are just starting to be informed by the realization that ignorance is more than a deficit or absence that must be supplied with as yet acquired information, as Conway argues. Ignorance has a pervasive and basic impact on human cognition, emotion, action, social interaction, and that is therefore an essential component of human connections, our cultures, and organizations. As one of the structuring factors of inequality in society that reproduce their own circumstances of existence, race is intricately involved in the reproduction of our worldviews. Next slide. Previous slide. Yes, thank you. So I want to speak to this slide a little bit, and it was through a recent talk that Ndlozi from the EFF made, talking about, again, the importance of history and understanding history in how we make sense of today. And these are pictures that I took yesterday. I went home for the weekend. And this is Sasol. And in his talk, he goes back to speaking to how even the landscape, the ways in which we think about townships and urban areas, how all these were designed, are also intricately linked to this idea of which bodies matter, right? So when Sasol, we all know about Sasol, right? We go, we buy our petrol at Sasol. And when Sasol was first designed, there's a township just outside Sasolburg called Zamdela. And that's where I was born and grew up. Because it also comes from Zamdela. And so looking back to how the spatial planning was done for Sasol, it really just shows the workings of apartheid. They got a French landscaper to come and look at how to design the space. And we know that toxic chemicals that come out of there as they produce the things that they produce there at Sasol. And they looked at the wind, the direction of the wind, and decided that, okay, the wind is going that way. So as you won't see, but there's a permanent smoke that comes out. And so those fumes and the chemicals need to go towards which direction. And then how they built the township decided who was going to be where. White people were going to be on the other side, the opposite of where the fumes would be going. And then the Black people would be on the other side. So I'm born, I grow up in that space. And there's this stench, there's this smell that you grow up with that you kind of get used to as a child as you grow up, because you don't question, you don't understand. And the idea and the conversations and the decisions that were made on that sole basis of which bodies count, who can just die and it's okay. And I consider myself like even today that I don't have sinuses or asthma or breathing issues or challenges. I cannot say the same for many of my family members. All my nephews and nieces, we have to sign with this, sign with that, all of that. But what we then end up becoming, or how we get to normalize what should not be normalized, is things that are entrenched in the system itself. That when you go to town, there's no smell, but as soon as you drive back towards the township, there's this smell, right? And these are the workings of apartheid. It's not just the workings of apartheid then that ended in 1994, because now I'm talking about the next generation. I'm talking about my nieces and nephews, my children who are in Sasolburg, in Zamdela, who are still also suffering as a result of a decision that was made decades ago. And these are the workings of what coloniality is about. And as we think about challenging what we are experiencing in this current moment, these are some of the things that we need to be thinking about. It's thinking about us visiting the graves to go honor our departed grandparents, our ancestors. That my ancestors are buried just outside of Sasolburg in a little rural place called Wolvehoek. That when we want to go and visit there, we need to get permission from the owner of the farm that was taken from my great-grandparents many years ago. However, today when I want to go visit my grandmother, my mother's mother, we need to get permission first because that land belongs to the white farmer. That for me to commune and have a conversation and go visit my ancestors, I need permission. So this white farmer has got ownership of the resting place of my ancestors. This is in 2023. So when we speak about ignorance and when we speak about exhaustion, these are the things that are exhausting, that things remain the same as we move forward. That when we think about knowledge production in our institutions of higher learning, these are some of the conversations that we often do not have. That our colleague in the Free State, when he dares to speak truth, to challenge the history books, that you would go for disciplinary hearing. So this is what we're talking about. And I go back to Mills. In the racial contract, Mills argues that a political and historical explanation of the contemporary world has a comprehensive discussion on white ignorance, white deliberate ignorance, white convenient ignorance. The racial contract is posited as a historically provable agreement, whether explicit or tacit, to the racial system, to white supremacy that exists even today, to what can be termed whiteness. So it is therefore an epistemic dimension that is generally characterized, as Mills argues, by white ignorance, misrepresentation, avoidance, and self-deception in race-related subjects. So as we historicize whiteness and pay attention to the material factors that allow certain white people to take their whiteness for granted, it is white people who are themselves the privileged offspring, later descendants, or raised inheritors of the social order of those who constructed and maintained projects of racialized white supremacy. And here I'm speaking, echoing the words of Milazzo, who you will also get to hear in the next coming days. So white supremacy still requires vigilance and self-consciousness on the side of white people, because who wants to lose privilege, right? As shown by paying attention to the larger context that has made racism an object of analysis deserving of additional critical attention. So often we reflect and we engage on the challenges, the issues that are confronting us as we reclaim, as we learn and unlearn, as we continue on this quest of Blackness and humanization of Blackness. But we also need to give attention to the problematic of whiteness, as it's also central in the ways in which the world functions. Academic ideas of white ignorance are at odds with the pervasive reality that white people actively seek to maintain their status as the dominant race. Understanding the significance of racial awareness is essential for recognizing and discrediting perspectives that promote hierarchy as natural and fair. And Kimberly Crenshaw here asks us to really take seriously the idea of intersectionality, of how things are interconnected. And therefore we cannot understand these things in isolation. So the idea of whiteness and white people have strategically used ignorance to their advantage, right? I wasn't there. I didn't know. And so the idea of intergenerational accumulation of wealth, of privilege, vis-a-vis the intergenerational accumulation of wounds and suffering and trauma, and the fact that our young children have to be contemplating about the challenges of the world that we created, means that we cannot afford to be ignorant. So the idea of white ignorance is insufficient to explain the pervasiveness of colorblind reasoning in today's academic, political, and structural spaces. It is deliberate ignorance and can no longer hold. So what do we need to do? I suggest that we look inward in our search for healing, because I believe that we are wounded as a people. The white oppressive capitalist system will keep us busy and leave us exhausted. So I implore us to heed the call of Linda Tuchiwai-Smith to speak and write back. Maori scholar Linda Tuchiwai-Smith advocated for indigenous scholars to write back against the Western colonial frameworks imposed on indigenous people. In response to this rallying cry from Smith, a number of academics have compiled the viewpoints of indigenous scholars from all over the world who are pushing back against colonial education by publishing their own works, teaching what we like, even if it means you end up jeopardizing your prospects for promotion, or whether you end up being put under disciplinary hearing. But it also means that we need to be able to support each other, because the system always fights back, right? So when we don't support each other, then the system will suffocate you. These academic works that have been coming, the work that we've been trying to do with the decolonial project, the decolonial agenda, the work aims at investigating and centering work that is at the intersection of social justice education, indigenous studies, and decolonizing research, because we need to move away from the idea of education for the market, education so that you can be employable tomorrow, but education that alienates you from yourself, education that tells you that you are inferior, but as long as you get a job, that cannot be sufficient. So we are conscious of the fact that education has in the past and in the present served to advance the privilege of those who are already privileged while undermining the rights of the marginalized people. Many positive steps have been taken in recent years to advance educational equity and justice here and there, but persistent challenges keep education mired in its colonial and dehumanizing past. We are encouraged to question which injustices have not yet been addressed, and whether we should do so within or beyond the walls of our institutions of higher learning. And I argue that we cannot limit the work that we're doing within the institutions of higher learning, because much of the work that is necessary and what we can learn is embedded in our communities. So this idea of the ivory tower, of the university as all-knowing, is something that we need to constantly critique. So as we pause for a moment and reflect on our institutions of higher learning, we need to ask, how are we supposed to serve the hegemonic structure of the university? How do we stop public institutions from reproducing the same kind of violence that has existed for so long? What practical change is necessary in the field of higher education? We have a responsibility to our students many of whom originate from disadvantaged backgrounds, to give these issues priority in our lecture rooms. We need to be accountable for taking action and creating change. We are challenged to evaluate not only our actions, but also our inactions. We can commit to a justice-oriented framework, but the complexities of these issues present extra challenges for us. How can we ensure that these discussions and ideas reach a wide audience without watering them down or making them seem as if they're less pressing or important? It is inconceivable that we would take this step without our students. So who produces knowledge? What is the role of our students? We are here as academics, many of us, because we want to contribute towards the facilitation of the rethinking and challenging the status quo. At least some of us are trying to do that work. Eve Tuck and Michelle Fine suggest that we should understand social justice as a service rather than a moral compass only. The project of decolonization at the center or at the core of it is about social justice. We know, colleagues, the term decolonization has become widely used as a metaphor in educational advocacy and research, as seen by calls to decolonize our schools, to apply decolonizing methodologies, and to decolonize student thinking. Forcing ourselves to operate within and upon epistemologies of ignorance when ontological erasure is the norm is a significant mental and emotional investment. The methods we have been using and have inherited are not always adequate and can sometimes mask the full extent of an epistemological or ontological problem, as argued by Ndlovu. So trying to challenge a system with entrenched colonial ideologies is exhausting, sometimes can be quite lonely. The immense anguish and pain that many South Africans, those who came before us, have endured over decades is something that we inherited. The daily violence we witness distorts our perception of the world and leaves many individuals permanently injured. Some people have left academia even because of the violence, the perpetual violence at multiple levels that we experience in these spaces. The fact that there are so few tools at our universities to acknowledge what some of the research we conduct, for example, does to our researchers is indicative of the importance we place on academic identity and the ableist delusions we create regarding our links to the database, to being cited, right? To the promotions that we seek, which are important, but at what cost? So I think we also need to think about that. It's unfortunate that many of us have to battle this idea of being the ideal researchers, as the academy was never designed to welcome, nurture, or develop Black people. When it comes to liberatory research, academic institutions, and the epistemic terrain, there is often a disconnect. And you see this when you want to go and apply for ethical clearance, the kinds of questions that you would be asked and things that you'd be expected to do. And that's where the disconnect comes in. So you are forced to fit into a box to be able to do work that the institution is comfortable with, right? Because at the end of the day, for whose benefit and for whose credit is the work that we're doing? So the consequences of this discord can be dreadful. Being able to realize the challenges ontological erasure poses to academics who are deeply immersed in the environment we are striving to understand was made possible by the opportunity to use subjectivity And creative writing, as we saw from young people today, as suggested by Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, because sometimes to challenge and to speak back and to dream and to hope for a better future, you actually need to be disobedient. It requires one to think creatively, to be able to write the beautiful but very punchy essays that our young people have written. It requires you to look at that work of art and be challenged by it. But often, when we write within the academic spaces, we are forced to write in a way that removes that dreaming and imagination from the work that we're doing. And so Linda Tuhiwai-Smith challenges us to move towards actually embracing this imagination and creativity. So when I work with community women and we make embroideries to think about how we understand issues of trauma away from the pathologizing idea of what my discipline has taught me to understand trauma, to understand intergenerational trauma, to understand gender trauma, as it relates to some of the things that Melissa was talking about what women were denied legislatively as a result of patriarchy, as a result of apartheid. How do those traumas move from one generation to the next? How do you theorize that lived trauma and woundedness that many women had to go through? Many are still going through, not knowing where their children disappeared when the special forces took them and they never saw them again. How do I theorize that trauma? And not limited to just saying people are going through PTSD, but understanding broadly that it moves beyond the individual, that it's a family trauma, it's a community wounding. And this is the kind of work that we need to be thinking about. And this is what the creative arts, visual methodologies that I also try to employ in the work that I do, assist us to be able to do. When we're talking about issues around fertilization and how that happens, but also around public health. And when we're talking about obstetric violence in our public health institutions, how do we speak to that in a way that allows women the agency to be able to speak about the violence and the indignities that they experience when they go into these public health systems? Again, the kinds of systems that were put in place deliberately by a system that says no, but they don't require or don't need good public health system. Right? So how do we then understand that all of these things are interconnected? And in our quest to decolonize, to understand that change needs to happen, that it cannot be just us theorizing and talking about this, but it's us in collaboration with, alongside, working with our communities, those who actually live and experience the social death that Black people experience each and every day. And we can link this back and go back a bit to see how all of these are connected, right? To the global economy of extraction, of exhaustion, of enslavement, and how the repercussions of all of that live with us even today. How Black women's bodies and wombs were turned into capital, and their offspring were turned into currency, right? So you're forced to have children so that they can be currency, so that they can be bodies that can be sold to work in the plantation. We know slavery was a huge capitalist project, right? Slavery transformed the womb into a factory, generating Blackness as a division like the hold of a slave ship or a jail, as Verges argues. So nature was changed into a commodity, and a cheap one at that, right? For the enjoyment, the pleasure, and the profit back then and now, of the master. When you think about the banking system, the owner of the industry, the owner of Sasol, the extraction and exhaustion of the vital energy of Black people and the natural resources was the foundation of primitive accumulation. So even our institutions of higher learning today play into that idea, because even in institutions of higher learning, we speak about profitability. You risk not getting a promotion, comrade scholar, if you do not bring any money into the institution, right? It's about this accumulation so that we can be ranked, so that we can be number 1 or number 5. It's about the students and their employability. And how is that different then from this idea of profit for the master? Institutions functioning as if they are industries, because we produce so that we can send out to the marketplace. So how we have shifted understanding education and what it means and what it stands for. I'm going to move towards conclusion. The global economy based on this extraction, exhaustion, and enslavement shaped the ways in which Black people lived, still live, right? The way that they worked and the way that they experienced their surroundings. It continues to this day. Extraction economy necessitated a politics of terror, of torture, and of murder. The inequalities, the unemployment that we experience today makes many of us live in terror, right? Because we are afraid of the crime, something that has been created by the system. Because if we live in a society that is as unequal as we are, how do we expect to live in peace, really? Makes no sense. Without blinking an eye, racial capitalists made the decision that millions of people would be denied access to adequate life. The inequalities that we see today. And so fatigue, depletion, and exhaustion are typical weapons of heteropatriarchy, alongside fear, alongside powerlessness and marginalization that were used to silence and kill Black people. So even though the effects of these injustices and violations, as the South African Shack Dwellers Movement founder and president Bullsh has remarked, that we ought to be geared by the agenda of rehumanizing the world. In these tragic times, when predatory capitalism, violent patriarchy, and political catastrophe still reign, we are to stress the importance of appreciating all gestures, all efforts that contribute to humanizing the world, as Vegas argued. So when people are struggling for their very survival, sometimes it's very difficult to be conscientized and conscientize others. The system based on white supremacy keeps us so busy that we are too exhausted to reflect, to look within and embrace who we are. It is in our schools where children have to fight for the right to keep their natural hair, when they're supposed to just be children and enjoying education and thinking and playing. They have to be worried about their hair and how their hair is not presentable. Being bombarded with poisoned food in the supermarkets and being kept busy so much that one cannot plant your own garden. It is colonial structures that forever remind us that we do not belong. It is all this exhaustion that leads to the victims being blamed for not building their own schools. You're complaining, why don't you build your own schools? With which time? When we're kept so busy all the time. So the willful ignorance keeps whiteness in a state of bliss. Ladies and gentlemen, we need accountability, acknowledgement, and willingness to understand that when people say we want the land back, it is about wanting their humanity back. It is about being tired of living in squalor. It is about having space to bury the umbilical cords of our children. We need to embark on this project of unlearning and relearning, which, as we know, is at the center of the decolonial project. Decolonization is about understanding that we are on this journey of rediscovery, and this journey is also at the same time the journey of healing, the journey of psychic healing, generational healing, the journey of acknowledging the trauma we have experienced over generations. It is acknowledging that part of the healing process involves getting to know ourselves again. The project is not an individual project, it's a collective endeavor. It is a multidimensional work. It is multidimensional work that requires the contribution of all of us. It requires, in the case of my home discipline, psychology, to challenge itself, to critique its problematic history, and embark in the process of remaking and redefining itself with a framework that acknowledges and centers Indigenous way of being in the world. This collective endeavor was recently illustrated creatively by Professor Joe Disho, who used the analogy of the zebra. He argued that South Africa is a zebra state, with white and black spots coexisting. When you hurt the white part, the whole gets hurt, and vice versa. So I would like to argue that the pain does not hit us the same, though, right? Necessarily, because when you have a long history of privilege and access to good private health, your wounds might be attended to differently. It is this understanding and accountability that is required. Until we are willing to shift from willful ignorance and acknowledging the work that needs to be done by all of us, we cannot reach social justice. I call on us to become what Bell Hooks calls self-actualized risk takers. Many South Africans die both spiritually and physically every day. One just needs to switch on the television or page through daily newspapers to see the suffering which people encounter on a daily basis. They walk around like hollow pipes, empty inside, with nothing to give. Feeling heavy, many people move forward to just meet another day, but they merely survive. They do not thrive. As Matsilo Mutsei reminds us, dead bodies walk the streets as they decompose into a state of moral and spiritual rot. Have we ever truly grieved over our painful past? What happened to the burdens of our past? Remembering is crucial to our very survival, to the breaths we take day in and day out. How is it possible for a mother to bear a child and then leave him only to die? This is because the maternal umbilical cord is lost, both figuratively and literally. So let's be kind and not be quick to judge. Where do we start to reconnect ourselves, to who we once were? What does it mean to be fully human in this current moment? To live just lives. Those issues do not call for policies or laws to be enshrined in glossy documents. They require us to search deep within ourselves to reignite our spirits. And I just want to show the last slide as something to leave with you as we think about the ways in which we can imagine decolonization or the process of decoloniality. And here, just drawing from Pokalaini, who's a Waianae, from Waianae community in Hawaii. And I just loved how the idea of decolonization in these 5 phases can be thought about, that it's about us rediscovering and recovering who we are, our lost histories, our languages, our identity. Ngugi wa Thiong'o speaks about the importance of our language and how the internal or intentional erasing of our African languages was the part of colonization. Also understanding that when we lose our language, we lose who we are. So that rediscovering is very important. And of course, we have lost so much as a people, as part of our history. And so it's also about pausing and mourning the loss, and then waking up anew and saying, how do we move forward? But it's also understanding the continuous assault as we speak about climate change, the perpetual assault to the land, to our connection to it, assault to the colonized people, and mourning that loss is critical as part of the decolonization journey, because decolonization, more than anything, is about healing so that we can be able to live again and move on. It's about dreaming, right? The imagination that I spoke about earlier, where we draw from our indigenous knowledge systems, where we draw from our histories, where we center our worldviews, and shift from just using borrowed and imported theories and saying, how do we theorize from where we are, right? So it's about dreaming and imagining new theories, centering our histories and theorizing from that place of who we are. And that requires the commitment that I just spoke about, where we speak about pluriversality, multiple voices, where there isn't just a single truth, the universal truth, that there is so much to be learned if we open up the space for multiple ways of being and understanding the world. And it's about what we choose to take on moving forward. We theorize, it's important to critique, to theorize, but it's also about taking action. So where we are sitting as young people, as students, what kind of a world would you like to see for yourself? I challenge you. But it's also about us in academia to say, can the status quo remain? How do we move forward? How do we imagine taking action in rethinking and reimagining the world? And with that, Comrade Scholar, I also just want to acknowledge my partner in this journey and thinking together with me, my colleague, Ms. Puleng, who is here with me. She's been very instrumental in my thinking as well around this work. So I just want to acknowledge and thank her. Thank you so much.
I told you that Prof will not only invite us to think, but will also really trigger us to that universe of activism, of doing something about the colonialities that confront us. Melissa, this is not going to be an event. It will be a process that will be progressed forward. And we will try to expand these ideas further. Rudo Mzide, that leads our journal portfolio, will be in conversation with you, Prof, in working towards getting this presentation to be published and circulated in the International Journal of Critical Diversity Studies. So we are going to amplify this work, Melissa, and take it further up to where it is needed. When you were speaking, Prof, just that critical idea of the thinking woman who is actually a criminal in the scheme of things, because women are not structured and systematized to think in the colonial scheme of things. So many ideas crossed my mind as you were reflecting on, especially the epistemology of apartheid, that apartheid, as dark and as evil as it was actually thought out by geniuses. J.M. Coetzee published this very relevant and important paper, The Mind of Apartheid, where he was reflecting about the work of Jeffrey Cronje, that there are actually monsters who sat down in their closets and philosophized how apartheid should work, how it should be implemented. Besides the legalization, there was the sociologization, the psychologization, and philosophization of apartheid and coloniality. And thinking women, it crossed my mind that we have right here Mam Nonkululeko Gobodo, the first black chartered accountant woman in South Africa, is amongst us here. And rubs shoulders and thinks together with us a lot at WiCDS, and we are so proud and delighted now. Thank you so much for your presence and the inspiration that you give to us and our students. One of the champions of the Enlightenment project, that is Immanuel Kant, said, "Dare to know," which is punchy and very important. But for us, from where we are thinking and what we are thinking about and the time when we are thinking, it's not enough just to dare to know. We also have to do a lot of work in unknowing and thinking and unlearning certain things. And the project of undisciplinarity, because these disciplines that have been given to us, they actually do that work of colonially disciplining us, making us ignore, making us not know, and making us not see some of the important violences that you illuminated in your presentation. It's very important, Prof, that you deposited this. Melissa, I apologize, I'm not going to be teaching further than this, but as Prof was speaking, it also crossed my mind the importance of thinking about where we are working, the university, especially in South Africa. There is the important research of Professor Robert Krieger on the university in South Africa. Why and when it was created as a system. These universities were created as university campuses of universities in the West. So it's not Grossvogel who was the first to reflect on the westernized university in Africa. Robert Krieger reminds us that this institution was created for the sons of empire that were supposed to further the colonial project. You are not in the plans, Melissa. You are not in the plans, Prof. You are not in the plans, Mam Goboto. This was created for the white boys, not even the black boys. So just being here is on its own a decolonial project. So I invite you to visit Robert Krieger and really look at that history and work with it. And at what time, it's my last point, Melissa, are we thinking, and what place, and what moment in the world? We are doing this work that Prof. Segalo is pushing at a time when oppressions have really become vivid, where ignorance is. Look at us in the eyes. As we speak and as we do the work that we're doing, the world is in tenterhooks. That war in Ukraine there, and what is happening in Gaza now and in Israel, are just symptoms of the shifts that are taking place in the world. And we can't look aside. So thank you, Prof, for pushing that work that Hannah Arendt spoke about, to think in dark times and to think without a banister, and to combine vita activa and vita contemplativa. the life of activism and the life of contemplation. Thank you, Prof, for doing this with us today. Melissa, thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for making this happen. So there's this moment that we should complement what Professor has said. Prof, ask questions, make comments, and all that. And we've got a whole 30 minutes, Melissa. Eh? Thank you so much. I was so guilty that I was eating into time, but please, let's enjoy the Mel, do you want to say something? I'm putting you on the spot. Melissa is a sister, do you know that? Please, Mel, come and say something. We have a roving mic somewhere. Melissa is not the only one that speaks, and that is typical. You've got Mel. Please.
You know, Melissa warned me that William was glad that I was coming, but I didn't think he was going to do this to me. But yes, thank you. I just want to say that it's wonderful having Melissa as a sister, because I have learned, as you can imagine, so much from her, and we love sharing discussions. So I just want to say it's been a privilege so far, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conference. I haven't been in Johannesburg for 10 years, and this is so stimulating and so wonderful. And Professor Puleng, what an honor to have heard you and to have listened carefully to everything you had to say. So all I can say as someone who grew up extremely privileged is it's probably, I don't know if you will think it's appropriate, but it's an opportunity for me to say, I'm sorry. Truly, truly. You know, one can't really apologize on behalf of one's ancestors, really, because you weren't there. There is some truth in that. I wasn't there, but I knew. You know, before you knew academically and with a conscious knowledge, you knew in your heart, because you just had to look around you and you could see. But there's something very strange going on here. I have this, and children are wonderful, aren't they? Because you have little kiddies, you put them together, there's no difference. But then as they grow up, they have to be taught these terrible structures. And in our case, the South African reality was more terrible, I think, than anywhere else at that time in the world, probably. So thank you for the opportunity to say, for what it's worth, I'm sorry, and I intend to work and to continue working for a better South Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mel. Thank you. Do I recognize anyone? Yes.
Like a big the audiences are receiving it. It's very stimulating. It's my first, and I'm very excited to attend the to come. It's students, I just want to say, it's super fun here. I just and sharing your dreams. It just that said, yeah, that society. this one, society and something needs to be around activism. How see social injustices, social problems that we have. How do we this? Yeah, that's things
Thank you very much, especially for centering the students. Melissa, we don't get enough time to confess that our students teach us. Yeah, and thanks for celebrating the learners that came to join us here from Africa Tikkun and our students at the same time and beyond. Thank you. Who else do I recognize? Zenon, I recognize you.
students center, beautiful center. And East Africa. It's teachers that I was able to see. So, look. For social justice. Because somebody would have the community and everything like it's just with like I of us combination to the launcher. Sports has conceptualized the concept of counterbalance, which is considered as a self-defense. See it as violence, but it's not violence itself. It's just has been dispersed of the humanity. Prof. Segalo. And then I could go and check who you are. Before I discovered that you are a great son, you are a great profession. Our ideas of not active, not to be activist, but make sure that we are active.
I will ask Mam Nonku to share a word with us. Thank you. Thank you. I recognize you coming.
Hi, my name is Nongula Koboto. When I was listening to you, and sharing these sad stories that we've heard over and over and over again, and each time you hear these stories, you know, your heart sinks, and you wonder, when will they ever end? I was not an official activist in this space for a long time because I just struggled with a struggle that depends on others changing for my situation to change. That if white people would change, my situation as a Black person would change. If men would change, my situation as a woman would change. And I sort of participated in my own way. But I then came to a place of saying, looking at my age and looking at my grandchildren, and worried that my grandchildren will arrive at the same world that I've lived in, I can't keep quiet anymore. But I then said, okay, how do I participate? How do I become active in this space? And I said, I'm not going to focus on the oppressor, right? Because we know the story of the oppressor, but I'm going to focus on Black people and women. Because I asked myself, when you complain about the slow pace of transformation, who are we complaining to, really? Who can champion our transformation better than ourselves? So my focus at Awakened is to say, how can we awaken to who we truly are? Because we are all conditioned, both Black and white. White people are conditioned. I mean, these stories that we're sharing, only conditioned people would do the things that we shared today. But we are also conditioned. How do we free ourselves from conditioning? We can't wait for others to free themselves because they enjoy the privilege. But I'm sure we can do something to uncondition our own selves. But you spoke about healing, and that's the part that really worries me. How do we really reach people with this healing? I mean, psychologists and academics talk about these things among themselves, but I don't know, how are we going to really reach people to heal? Because you can't uncondition someone who's wounded. If maybe you can share a bit about how we can do that.
Unconditioning the condition. Thank you so much, man. Just say your name and then share with us.
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Jane Rousseau. I did my master's at WiCDS in 2021. I just have to say, Melissa, your framework has become my Bible. I just share it with anyone wherever I can. And I think that's to speak to your point, that was Ayanda, if I'm not mistaken, about practical things that we can do. But it starts with recognition first. And I think if I go back to the CDL framework, if it wasn't for that and looking at all the different components there are with regards to power and oppression, I wouldn't have been able to recognize all the things that I recognize now. And then moving forward, I'm able to say, okay, even in the smallest way, something is playing out in this way, and I can then take it into bite-sized pieces to be able to work properly or practically, let me say, at a grassroots level. But if it's not for recognition and being able to truly identify the problems in the various ways that it shows itself, we're not going to be able to do much moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen. There are colleagues that are connected online. So after this round, I will attend to them so that they can also make their contributions. Just say your name and submit your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Celia Chaucer. I'm visiting from Science University in London. I'm a PhD candidate, and I'm delighted to be here. It's just luck that I happen to be here. So very interested in Professor Segalo. I was intrigued by energizing South Africa with Germany, which is something that I have done occasionally to try and sort of explain things to people who perhaps aren't the political and social history of this country. In my research, I draw the analogy to South Africa and the United States, which I think is I think it's slightly more than just sort of comparing it with Germany and how they came through after the war. I have a question for you. It's if there's a degree of iconoclasm, which is necessary for systemic change. How do we go about when economy is so enslavement extraction of wealth from Black people to this day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lerato. Jamil, I'm coming to you just now.
Thanks, Prof. You got me to think deeply about issues of coloniality. So economic it's like you know, understand and that's one thing so it's a lot.
Thank you so much for that question. Prof will have time to reflect after we have made our contributions. Jamil wrote an interesting book called Karma. For the past 2 years, I've been trying to get them to sign my copy, and they've avoided it. I plead with you as a conference to press it upon them to sign my copy. Jamil.
I don't sign books for me. Thanks, Prof. One thing that came up for me when you were speaking was, so at some point you were speaking about, or you centered the academy, right? Obviously as an academic and the work that we do in the academy and how we do this work in relation to the conversations around ignorance. And I think one of the things that I always struggle with, and I say this to Melissa, it's like a center like WiCDS, for example, existing at WITS is a paradox, right? Because the agenda of the Western-based university is everything that is the antithesis of what is trying to be done at a center like WiCDS, right? But somehow it's one avenue through which we do this work. Sometimes feel that I don't know how far we can get while positioning the critical work within the master's house, you know. And so I'm wondering, as a scholar, as an academic who is in the university, when we have these conversations that we are currently having, how do you think through around that paradox? Because I do believe it's a paradox. I don't think that is something that's up for contestation, you know. Yeah, that's the question.
Thank you, Jamil. Thank you so much. Dr. Banyoro, is there anyone else that will want to say something?
Thank you, William, for putting me on the spot. I actually didn't have a specific question, also having come late. Ironically, you got to speak to the point that the colleague at the back was talking to. We have a group of pizza students, second and third years, who are visiting. from the States, and they come here for a month. So I am coordinating that program. So when we're talking about the connections between South Africa and the United States, just a few minutes, an hour ago, before I came in. So yeah, I think what stood out for me, which we're also talking about, is the question of speciality. And also, I mean, the question of drawing connections, because when we're talking about education, you grew up in where the smoke was directed towards your space. The same applies for Zimbabwe, from the small town called Kwekwe. There's a smelting company called Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe has these blast furnaces, and the smoke is swayed towards Mbizo, which is the township. I just wanted to find out, particularly someone who uses all of these movements as ethnographic reflections. What is your experience in terms of the legitimacy of using some of your historical experiences where ethical clearance meant to do that kind of work and submit those experiences in journals, documenting narratives of things that happened before any ethical clearance. I think the challenge for me has been if I used it as a method to brand your. So I actually justifying to say, at that point, did I even know what was happening? Are the ethics to talking about those other people's stories in an academic space? So I don't know if it actually it makes sense, but the point is, sort of as researchers and also people that do sit on these ethics committees, strong suggestions around ethnography and reflections, and really something that cannot necessarily be fenced. And it's a challenge that I think we need to acknowledge, so that a lot of things that don't get ignored because they don't take place within the parameters of a research space. That is. Thank you, Doc.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banyoro. Anybody else before I go to the colleagues online? Nontobeko, I recognize you.
Thank you for putting me on the spot. I think for me, it was just reflecting on the accountability. The issue of the professor or the doctor spoke about white people who say that they were not born. And it just made me think about other areas within our society where we can kind of avoid the accountability. It doesn't have to be a question of racism as such, but it can be gender, it can be sexuality issues. And I was just thinking around what suggestions she has in terms of how to engage just accountable, even with other issues, not racial issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nontobeko. Any other colleague in the audience that wants to make a contribution? I recognize you. Your name and then.
Hello, everybody. My name is Vanessa. First of all, I want to thank Prof. Segalo for her talk. I wanted to comment on the ignorance over legacies of apartheid. So, in the beginning of the year, black students were striking. They used to vote with a friend over issues about registration, residences, and all that kind of stuff. So we had other group of students, particularly white students, who came out and said they also deserved an opportunity to be in tutorial rooms and study. And that was ignorance, because I think most students wouldn't be here if it wasn't for going to education in the first place. I know that my father is a smart man. I took my brains from him. And he wanted to be an advocate, but he couldn't because of going to education. Otherwise, he would fund my studies, but he can't. He's a taxi driver now, and I have to rely on NSFAS to fund my education. So these are the results, these are the consequences of apartheid. And if now we're going to have the students, the offsprings, out and saying they deserve to be in the classroom, while there are angry black students who cannot afford education because of what has been done by the forefathers in the past. That way is ignorance. And I love that Umama is in the comment that transformation has to start with us because people are comfortable in these privileges that they have. And people are comfortable in these privileges that they have. So my question for you is, how do we solve the ignorance of these legacies of apartheid? Thank you.
Thank you so much, colleague. Let's try and engage with our colleagues online. How do we do that? Melissa? Before, I just didn't want to keep them in the, okay. All right. Melissa suggests that we can give Prof the platform to answer the questions and respond to the comments while we connect with our colleagues virtually. Thanks, Prof.
Great. And thank you everyone for your reflections, your comments, your questions. I do not promise to provide answers. I'll also just reflect back as we continue to think together, I think, on these issues. So you ask, how do we become active activists? How do we do this work? I think one of the things that's important for us to do is to not limit ourselves or confine ourselves to the academic spaces that we find ourselves in. And it's a conscious decision, I believe, that we need to make to be able to do that work outside of the lecture hall, outside of the classroom. One of the things that institutions of higher learning succeed in doing is that they keep us very busy. And we're so busy that we don't have time to be able to go out and do this work. And if you are busy with people in the communities or busy trying to be an active academic or activist, then when do you publish? Right? Because at the end of the year, you need to have 2 or 5, otherwise you did not perform. Right. So engaged scholarship or academic citizenship is 10%, but research is like 70%. So you're expected to publish. Why? Because publishing comes with money. Because publishing is about, again, the marketization of knowledge and the ownership of knowledge. Because you publish, yes, to communicate with others and to share your knowledge, but also at the core of it, it's also about money. It's about the sustainability of the institution. So oftentimes we are kept busy. So it's for us to make that conscious effort not to allow ourselves to be consumed by all of that. It's about matrices and citations. And if you are in academia, you're playing that game, but also to what extent and at what expense as well to yourself and the commitments that you have. So we need to be able to do the work because we need to theorize, we need to produce knowledge, because if we don't produce knowledge, what are the young ones going to be reading, reflecting on and referencing? So we need to do that work, but we also need to balance and actually work with our communities. And I think the idea of the publishing or producing knowledge alongside this participatory action research way of doing things is that it allows you to be in academia doing the work, but it's work that's actually based on the work that you're doing in the community, and that informs what you're producing within the academia. And I personally have been doing that. And it works. It works. Of course, sometimes there are pushbacks within academia because it goes back to the issue of ethics and ethical clearance issues as well. How far do you do the work without getting the clearance, or when do you get the clearance? So that is also important. So if I think we try and shy away from this idea of the rankings, because it's also a political agenda. Who decides who gets ranked based on what, right? So it's your scope. None of them are based in the continent, and they're based on publications that allow only very few Africans. If I were to show you the UNESCO reports in terms of who's publishing and where they're publishing, then you realize that African voices continue to be missing with less than 10% in that conversation. And those are the things that determine the rankings that we have. So if we can move away from that and actually do the work that matters for ourselves as we are trying to reconfigure and change the conversation, I think that can be useful for us. So connecting that with what you were saying when you're around the politics of ethical clearings, for me, it's again at the core of the work that we're doing in the decoloniality agenda, because we know, again, when it comes to ethical clearance and how that came about in the first place, it was about the university. It was about the scientific agenda and how, again, Black bodies were used as guinea pigs for experiments in the labs and for science. And as a result, ethical clearance was never really about protecting people, us. Ethical clearance was about the institutions protecting themselves from lawsuits and everything related to that. And we just took on all of that. And now we're saying, no, we're protecting the community. And again, it's another marginalization and disrespect to the community, because it also assumes communities don't have agency. They cannot speak for themselves. They cannot decide for themselves. So I cannot go to a community if the university does not say, I should, and this is how I should do it. And so part of, I think, the decolonizing is actually saying we need to challenge our ethical clearance processes. It's something that we're doing, at least at UNISA, to say how do we indigenize or rethink or reframe the ways in which we understand ethical clearance. We understand confidentiality, anonymity, and consent, that we should not force people to be anonymized or use synonyms for people, because my name is who I am. It reflects my history. It connects me with my grandmother. It's my grandmother's name. So if you're going to interview me and then decide that you're going to say disable to protect me, you're not protecting me. You're taking away my history and you're taking away my story. So this idea, again, of all the different steps that we need to follow, I think that we need to critique. So that goes with the work that we're doing in the communities as well. So it's work that's ongoing that we need to rethink and challenge and question the taken for granted, the status quo that is within our institutions of higher learning. And then there was a question around accountability. And how do we think around accountability? I think accountability is very, very important because it also speaks to the idea of ignorance. I didn't know, I was not there. So how am I held accountable for something that I did not do, right? And so for the work that we're doing, and I think for the research that we're doing, are we doing research for the sake of doing research, or are we doing research because we want to see change and we want to see the work that we're doing actually shifting and moving us closer towards social justice work? And I think my response can be with an example of the work that I mentioned earlier on obstetric violence. So working with Abu Mama in the community, we reflect on the violence of our public health system. And one of the reasons of doing this work and actually creating visual pieces is so that we can challenge the health sector. So we then challenge the nurses and the doctors working within this system as a way of holding them accountable for the challenges or the violence that women experience when they go for their prenatal care or when they go to give birth to their children. Many of our mama indicate that after my first child and how I was treated, I never went back to the hospital. So it means I never go back for my prenatal. I just go to give birth because I do not want to put myself in a position where I'm going to be disrespected like that. So it's about accountability, that it's the safety of the child is the safety of the mother, but the system is structured in such a way that it makes people make decisions not to go to that institution because of how people are treated. So the work is now also being used by medical students to conscientize and to assist in thinking about what does it mean to become a doctor? What does it mean to provide care to people? So the politics of care, again, forms part of that accountability, right? So that's how then we think about accountability, where Mama was saying, we would like these pieces to actually go out. They were even saying the Minister of Health should actually see this embroidery so that he can get to understand what we go through in the communities, so that they can think about how they can shift the ways in which they provide care to communities. That for me is accountability. Accountability is around young people being gang raped last year in July, and then a year later when we have a session with the community to think about where things are and to have the different sectors, even the justice system and the police, to say it's been a year. We know about that gruesome rape that happened outside Krugersdorp. What has happened? Has anybody been arrested? Has there been progress? And us sitting in a room hearing that, no, we don't have any feedback for you, right? And what does that mean when it comes to accountability as it relates to gender justice and actually respecting women's bodies, where many of those young women are scared to walk in the streets as we speak right now, because justice has not been served. So that's accountability. So when you do work or research around gender-based violence, it's not just about us understanding it, but it's also about challenging the justice system to actually do something about this work, right? Or about the challenges that are happening. So those are just some of the examples. And I hope that you can think around this in your own work as well, in terms of what accountability could look like, right? What else was asked? What are some of the ways in which we can heal? What are some of the things that we can put in place? And as we know, healing is a journey, right? And coming from psychology, we think about someone going to therapy and speaking about their challenges. And then hopefully then the process of healing will start taking place. And I think the idea of understanding pluriversal way of looking at the world also means understanding healing from multiple perspectives, understanding that, again, psychology is just one discipline that, again, when it was created, it was not with the African child or mother or man in mind. And so even many of the theories that we use within psychology are theories that impose and pathologize. And so when we think about healing, is psychology in the way that it is and is practiced enough in our understanding of traumatic experiences that people go through? And I visited Rwanda, your neighbor there, and we know what happened in Rwanda, right, in 1984, and the trauma that resulted as part of the genocide that happened. And so if we look at that and say, what does healing look like in such a space? And there's a famous example that is often given, which again kind of really mocks psychology, where someone in Rwanda was reflecting on what happened, what the UN and others from outside did as a way to respond and to assist people to heal, that they brought psychologists in to come and talk to people to assist them to heal. So this man was saying, yeah, they came and they put us in this room. There was a chair, it was very dark, and they said we must talk about what happened, our issues. And the man said there was no sunshine, there was, we could not breathe, so the space did not really make sense. And so how does healing happen? And I got to spend time with a group of women in Rwanda who were looking at healing, drawing from the African traditional way of coming together and reflecting together. So the group is called Ingoma Nyasha. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but it's Ingoma Nyasha. And this is a group of women who came together to try and deal with the trauma of the genocide. And they do drumming. So they come together and do drumming. It's an intergenerational group of women. And it consists of women who were from both sides. So these are women who were victims. These are women who also, some of them have children as a result of the rape. So the idea is that for us to be able to rebuild and move forward as a people, we need to find a way to come together. So through this drumming, healing becomes possible, because here we're facing the perpetrator in the eye, or those who are implicated in what happened. And for us to come together to say, how do we rebuild? And through this collective process of drumming and singing together and moving together, we can reimagine what healing could look like. So I suggest that we think about some of the healing rituals. We think about some of our traditional ways in which people looked at what healing is and how do we define healing, making it broader than the way in which we understand healing. That when people went to war, in many African societies, they went to war because it's something that had to be done, but not killing each other for the sake of killing each other, but also understanding when you come back, when you take someone else's life, it causes an imbalance in your own system. So when you come back, what is it that needs to happen for you to be balanced again? That we learn that when people come back from war, they were not sent back immediately into the community, but they had to go through a cleansing ceremony where they come to a point where they are balanced again. And only when they're balanced can they go back to their communities, because it's understanding the chemicals and the balance that's within our systems, that if there is that imbalance, then that's going to cause challenges. When you go back to your community, your family, with that imbalance, it's going to influence your relationships and how you engage and relate to others in your community. And this was something that was understood, a different kind of psychology, if you will, in terms of how we think about wellness, well-being, and as a holistic endeavor and a holistic encounter. You asked a lot of questions, and I think some of them we can engage during lunch, because one comrade scholar also looking at me and saying how faith in her, and the communicating in English. I want to own that it's a kileto le telele nna nka thabela ke me mona ke bua ka Sesotho fela o ka ba monate ka akere go ba ke bua ka Sesotho sa ka ke bua ka pelo ya ka ke bua fela ka hloho ha ke bua ka Sekgowa ke tshwantse ke nahane pele hore ke reng, empa ha ke bua ka Sesotho ke bua ka pelo. Jwale he mosebetsi o re o etsang wa hore re nahane re khutlele morao re pele ke hore hape re nahane le ka maleme a rona hore thuto e malemeng a rona bong ba rona boteng ba rona botho ba rona bo malemeng a rona. And jwale university, which was created without us in mind, has created us to be these beings that we are today, that have removed us from who we are as a people. And the global economy is the project of death, Batung. It's the project that thrives on killing, on ensuring that only a few thrive at the expense of the rest. and it's about extracting, and killing. And so it requires us to also push back, to fight back in the work that we're doing, to fight back in centering ourselves and our communities, in what we choose to center in the work that we're doing as we move forward. I think it's a lifelong project, really, because it's very, very much vested on ensuring that to the death, profits, gains, and sadly our institutions have also bought into that. They've also bought into this idea of sustainability at the expense of the well-being and life. So I think I shall pause there, and thank you very much once again.
There is a colleague online, Pierre, that wants to say something. Can you enable them to speak?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Very clearly, Pierre. Thank you.
Thank you. I realize I'm now standing between you and lunch, so I will try and be brief. Thanks first to Prof. Puleng for her thought-provoking and challenging paper, which I'd love to read in more detail. You know, one of the things that I do is, with a particular faculty of my university, take a group of students over the last about 7 or 8 years to Freedom Park as an exploration of history and memory, trauma, and then we meet after they've visited the museum and walk through the park and talk about where are we, how do we locate ourselves in our different stories, and it's informed by my own thinking around privilege, around power, around history, around intersectionality. And what I'm finding there is that the white students particularly, but interestingly, a small percentage of the Black students as well, is an unwillingness, a complete unwillingness to talk about the past. And they'll say they've done all of this stuff in school, it's in the past, they want to move forward, and that in fact any conversation of this nature is harmful and taking them back. And even in my last session, there was a kind of a complaint about the fact of the approach that I was taking. I feel like this resistance is almost impossible to overcome, and part of me feels immobilized by it. And I wonder if anybody, I mean, I don't think there's a specific answer to this, but reflections on white resistance, white intransigence in thinking about the past, that they want to hold on to ignorance. And part of me wants to say, you're irrelevant. I don't want to be held ransom to the power you have in holding on to your ignorance. So I don't know, just more of a reflection than a question. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pierre. Thank you so much for that contribution. Prof. Delight, thank you so much for your contribution.
Thank you.
You will agree with me that we are much enriched, and we will work with this for a long time to come. Thank you so much, Prof, for happening to us and making this contribution. Melissa, I think from here we move to lunch, all right? Thank you so much, colleague. Let's meet at what time? At exactly 2 o'clock. So we will have a very short lunch session. Let's find ourselves back here and push the envelope. Thank you so much.